Hey, welcome back to Everyday Economics, the podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of the 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics is a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our podcasts at americastalking.com. We're recording this episode on Monday, June 12th. And joining me, as always, is Dr. Orphe Divounguy. He's a PhD economist. Dr. O, big week in the economic world. A bunch of things that are going on. Inflation numbers are going to come out tomorrow. We're taping this again on Monday, June 12th. Inflation numbers are going to be coming out. I'm sorry, they're coming out tomorrow?
Yeah, tomorrow. Inflation's out tomorrow. Fed decision day is on Wednesday. And so there's a lot of action this week. I got to tell you, a lot of action. I think a lot of people are concerned about what the Fed's going to do. So a lot of people think the Fed will pause. Okay, so that's kind of the consensus. But a lot of people are concerned about whether or not that's the right decision. There's kind of two camps out there. You got the camp that's saying inflation is still too high. Core inflation is, well above the Fed's 2% target. Look, employment increased more than expected in April, right? We even saw the good news on the employment report this past month was that wages had edged down slightly, and that the unemployment rate, right, there's a little bit more slack in the labor market. But a new report out of the San Francisco Fed actually came out and said, look, it's not wage growth. It's not growth in labor costs that are pushing up inflation. And in fact, inflation, the impact of labor cost growth on inflation is actually very small. And so that, makes me think that maybe, we shouldn't be so worried. The Fed shouldn't be so worried about wage growth and the labor market, but about everything else that could be, holding inflation this high. And when we talk about everything else, we're talking about food prices. We're talking about energy. OPEC's going to cut again, right? That might be an issue. So we're talking about all these other factors that are still somewhat driving the inflation picture. The inflation numbers are kind of higher than we want them to be.
I wanted to talk to you about that because, whether the overall inflation number is down, remember, inflation is a measure of a number of different economic markers, right? For people that are just filling up their grocery cart, boy, oh boy, inflation is not down. I am back on the road in Western Pennsylvania and got to spend the weekend with some family and friends, which was really nice. I went to the grocery store here and I bought a 5-pound bag of potatoes at the number one grocery provider in this region, $7.99 for a 5-pound bag of potatoes. And it wasn't as if I had just picked like some special, crazy, organic, no offense to people who like special, crazy, organic anythings, but this was nothing special. This is a bag of potatoes, 5 pounds for $8. My goodness. And frankly, the rest of my cart was priced comparably. I think people are really feeling the pinch, and not to say regardless of anything we might tell them about what's happening, they're getting bummed out about what's going on at the grocery store.
For sure. Again, you look at every possible indicator out there, except one. And let me go through them a little bit. So number of job openings increased. Well, we just said the San Francisco Fed doesn't think the labor market's playing a big role. So, let's dismiss the labor market. You then look at, CPI last month, PCE last month. All you see is an acceleration in recent months, right? You're not seeing it cool. The last month was higher than the 3-month average. And so you can see that basically it picked up a little bit. Then you looked at manufacturing PMI. The manufacturing sector had been in a contraction, and it still is in contraction territory, but it's actually been improving. As you see the new orders index increasing last month. And so, you wonder if whether or not the Fed really got the nail in the inflation coffin, right? And so that's the big question. You have a number of Federal Reserve officials come out very hawkish, saying that basically we haven't done enough. But there's reasons to worry, right? The Canadian Central Bank kind of did the same thing. The Fed is supposed to pause in June. Canadian Central Bank went ahead and paused for 3 or 4 consecutive months. And then all of a sudden, they restarted their interest rate hiking last week after that 4-month pause because inflation was running hot again. When we started this hiking campaign, we were talking about what happened in the 70s. And I think that's the big fear. Like, what you don't want if you're at the Fed, what you don't want is to pause and then realize that you paused too soon. And then inflation's running hot again. Because remember, the biggest pain for Americans today, it's not necessarily higher rates on credit cards and personal loans and all that stuff. It's inflation. Inflation has to come down. That's the biggest risk for us right now.
Let me ask you this. There's a story in the Wall Street Journal this weekend. The Wall Street Journal, I like it because it's probably, with regard to writing about business, is the most definitive source that publishes with consistency, right? I mean, the Wall Street Journal's out every single day. I mean, they are on top. Andy Kessler had a story that came out yesterday afternoon. And in the lead of that story, let me read the lead of this story to you. This is straight out of Wall Street Journal. It says, did you see the latest job numbers? Unemployment increased 339,000 in May, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Woohoo. But the same report showed that the number of unemployed persons increased by 440,000. Weird. Tech layoffs are coming, but so are shortages of cashiers and cooks. Also, last week, we saw the largest money inflow into the technology equity funds ever. The S&P is up 12% for the year, but it's down if you exclude 7 top tech names. We are living a Dickensian tale of two economies, the best and worst of times. I tell you, I think that we're all, anybody who's paying attention, and I thought that was very well written. And I think that hit home for me because we look at this factor. Oh, that's kind of encouraging. We look at this factor. Ooh, that's not so encouraging. It is such a quote unquote mixed bag of things that are going on right now.
Totally. I mean, I mentioned manufacturing PMI. Then services PMI came in really lower than expected, flat actually. Right? So stalling. You start to think, okay, well, maybe the economy is really slowing down, and that we should expect inflation to cool. But look, my thought here is that you have a number of factors that are keeping inflation elevated. Some of them include these climate shocks, right? So droughts, floods, the wildfires that affect food supply, disrupt supply chains.
I-95.
Exactly. Things like that are actually going to continue to push prices higher. And then you also have the kind of the self-inflicted pain, right? Caused by building permit delays, right? Onerous regulations, right? That restrict where and how we build. But ultimately, housing is still the largest contributor to the monthly inflation rate increase. You look at the numbers, what it boils down to is even though rent growth has slowed a lot in the past year, housing is still the largest contributor to the monthly inflation rate increase. And the only way to fix housing in this country is to build more housing units. And I really think that home builders could really be the Fed's biggest allies in bringing down the price pressures, right? Or at least mitigating the other price pressures that are the other factors that are causing, prices to remain stubbornly high. And last point, the stock market wealth is already lower than it was before the central bank's campaign against inflation began, right? So if you believe that consumers are spending out of their excess savings, well, we're almost running out of those, or spending out of their stock market wealth and maybe also their housing wealth. Well, stock market wealth is lower today than it was when the Fed began its campaign against inflation. But home values or home equity, housing wealth, is still near a record high, right? Home values have been slower to respond to the Fed squeeze when we saw a pullback by supply, a supply pullback that's kind of holding prices high, right? And of course, housing is still vastly undersupplied in most markets across the country. I think for that reason, even though housing is cooling, it's just not cooling fast enough. And again, really, really hot still at the bottom, right? Competitive for these more affordable units, entry-level units. And so that's really where we need more building. And until we do that, I think inflation might actually stay a little bit above the Fed's 2% target for a while.
We'll be back later this week for an update on the inflation numbers when they come in, and we'll also check in on what the Fed ultimately does. So thanks as always, Dr. O. For Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics at americastalking.com.